Section 9 of Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Les Langston. Great Men and Famous Women, Volume 6, by Charles F. Horne. Queen Louise of Prussia, by Mrs. Francis G. Faithfull, 1776 to 1810. There is at Paris, near Potsdam, a flower-bordered walk leading from a grotto overlooking the hovel to an iron gate, above which is inscribed May 20, 1810, and the letter L. Within the grotto an iron table bears in golden characters, "Remember the absent." These words were engraved by order of Friedrich Wilhelm III of Prussia, and the absent he would have remembered, the star of his life, who had lighted him so truly on his darkened way, was the wife who died of a broken heart before reaching middle age. Louise Augusta Wilhelmina, third daughter of Duke Charles of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, was born on March 10, 1776, in the city of Hanover. Her mother died when she was 6 years old, and henceforth she and her sister Frederica lived with their grandmother, the Landgraven of Darmstadt, sometimes at the Burgfreiheit Palace, sometimes at a chateau in the Herrengarten, sometimes by formal gardens and orangeries. The girls were brought up simply, making their own clothes and going much among the poor. Now and then they made expeditions to Strasbourg or the Vosges Mountains, and when the Emperor Leopold was crowned at Frankfurt, the Frau von Goethe housed them hospitably, and was highly entertained by the glee with which they worked a quaint sculptured pump in her courtyard. 2 years later the advance of French troops compelled them to seek refuge with their eldest sister, the reigning Duchess of Hildburghausen, and on their homeward way they visited the Prussian headquarters, that the Landgraven might present them to the king. His sons were with him, and long afterward the Crown Prince told a friend, "I felt when I saw her, 'tis she or none on earth." The wooing was short. On April 24, 1793, he exchanged betrothal rings with Louise and then rejoined his regiment. Soon after, the princesses of Mecklenburg went over to the camp, Louise appearing a heavenly vision in the eyes of Goethe, who saw her there. In December of that same year, Berlin, gay with flags and ablaze with colored lamps, welcomed Duke Charles and his daughters, and on Christmas Eve the diamond crown of the Hohenzollerns was placed on her fair head, and in her glistening silver robe she took part in the solemn torch procession round the White Saloon. Then her husband took her home to their palace in the Unter den Linden. They were very happy. In the sunshine of his wife's presence, the prince's spirit, crushed in childhood by a harsh tutor, soon revived, while Louise, though the darling of the court, was almost always content when alone with him. "Thank God you are my wife again," he exclaimed one day when she had laid aside her jewels. "Am I not always your wife?" she asked laughingly. "Alas, no. Too often you can only be the crown princess." Her father-in-law never wearied of showering kindnesses on his princess of princesses. On her 18th birthday, he asked if she desired anything he could give. "A handful of gold for the Berlin poor," was the prompt petition. "And how large a handful would the birthday child like?" "As large as the heart of the kindest kings." The castle of Charlottenburg, one of his many gifts to the young pair, proving too splendid for their simple tastes, he bought for them the manor of Peritz, about 2 miles from Potsdam. There Louise busied herself with household affairs, while her husband gardened, strolled over his fields, or inspected his farm stock. They played and sang together, or read Shakespeare and Goethe, while to complete this home life came two baby boys, Fritz, born in October 1795, and Friedrich Wilhelm in March 1797. Someone once asked Louise if this country existence was not rather dull. "Oh, no," she exclaimed. "I am quite happy as the worthy lady of Parrots." But in the late autumn of 1797, the king died, and the quiet freedom of Parrots had to be exchanged for the restraints of court life. Little as either of the two desired regal pomp, they played their new parts well. Friedrich Wilhelm, stately in bearing, and acknowledged as the handsomest man in his realm, looked every inch a king. And if his laconic speech and caustic criticism sometimes gave offense, the winning gentleness of his beautiful wife more than made amends. Nobles and citizens, statesmen, soldiers, and savants were alike made welcome, and Louise knew instinctively how to make each show at his best. With eager interest she discussed Pestalozzi's ideas with his disciples, and when Gottlieb Hiller, the poet son of a miner, was presented to her, she led him aside, and by the friendly ease with which she talked of things familiar to him, speedily banished his shyness. Indeed, ready as she was to recognize high gifts and to learn from all able to teach, yet it was to the obscure and suffering that her tones were most soft and gracious. Even in trifles her thoughtfulness was unfailing. When a count and a shoemaker were announced at the same time, she gave audience first to the shoemaker, for time is more valuable to him. At Danzig she constantly wore an amber necklace, because it had been the gift of the townsfolk. The voice which in childhood had pleaded for the panting footman running beside her grandmother's coach might still be heard interceding, for when the royal carriage was overturned near Warsaw, and the Oberk of Messerton raided the servants, Louise interposed. "We are not hurt, and our people have assuredly been more alarmed than we." Sometimes the midday meal was spread beneath a forest tree, and from far and near the peasants flocked to get even a glimpse of her lovely face. They followed in crowds while she and the king climbed the Schneekappe on foot, but loyal shouts died into awed silence when, at the summit, Friedrich Wilhelm bared his head, and the two, standing side by side, gazed at the glorious view. "That was one of the most blessed moments of my life," Louise said afterward. "We seemed lifted above this earth and nearer our God." They entered the mines at Woldenberg by a swift-flowing stream, and 20 years afterward the steersman of their boat was fond of telling how in the dark cavern, the Fox's Hole, he saw her well by the torchlight. "In all my life I never saw such a face. She looked grand, as a queen should look, but gentle as a child. She gave me with her own hands 2 Holland ducats. My wife wears them when she goes to church, for what she touched is holy." Louise had never meddled in foreign politics. She had been, she designed to be, only the Landsmutter. And even with the murder of the Duke d'Enghien, seized on Prussian soil, aroused in Berlin a storm of indignation, in which she fully shared, she yet sympathized in the mental distress which found vent in her husband's oft-repeated words, "I cannot decide for war." At last he did decide. In October 1805, Napoleon ordered Bernadotte to march his army corps through Anspach. This contemptuous comment on Prussia's 10 years' forbearance was too much for the king's pride. Armies were raised in Franconia, Saxony, Westphalia, and while the excitement was at a fever point, the Tsar came to Berlin. All his rare charm of manner was brought to bear, and at midnight, in the presence of Louise, the two monarchs, standing with clasped hands beside the tomb of the great Frederick, solemnly pledged themselves to a close alliance. Alexander departed to lead his Russians to Moravia, and Friedrich Wilhelm dispatched a protest to the French camp. But the envoy, Haugwitz, arriving on the eve of Austerlitz, waited the issue of the battle, and then, withholding his packet, proposed to the victor a fresh treaty with Prussia. There was wrath in Berlin when his doings became known. The king at first disowned the disgraceful compact, but Austerlitz had taught him what Napoleon's enemies might expect. French troops were already massing on his frontier, and in an evil hour he broke faith with the Tsar. To Louise, who neither feared foe nor deserted friend, that was a bitter time. Doubly sad, indeed, since most of the long winter was spent by the dying bed of her youngest child. When she lost him, her own strength broke down, and the doctors ordered her away to drink the Pyrmont waters. In the late summer she was able to rejoin her husband, and he had startling news to tell, for war with France was close at hand. Since Haugwitz's fatal agreement, Napoleon had heaped injuries on Prussia. Now at least king and people were of one mind. The young Prussian officers sharpened their swords on the French ambassador's windowsills. Patriotic songs were hailed with thunders of applause in street and theater, and when the Queen, clad in the uniform of her own hussars, rode at their head through the city, she was greeted with passionate loyalty. Unhappily, Friedrich Wilhelm, hitherto too tardy, was now too precipitate. He had been passive while France crushed Austria, and Austria, suspicious and disabled, neither could nor would assist him. Russia, with better reason for distrust, responded generously to his appeal, but he did not wait for her promised aid. For all his haste, Napoleon, with 180,000 men, was nearing the Thuringian forest before the Prussian troops left Berlin. They were very confident, those Prussian troops, and the shouting multitudes who watched the well-trained artillery and cavalry defiling by hardly dreamed of disaster. Yet it came almost at once. The Saxon corps, led by the king's cousin, Prince Louis, pushing on too fast, was surprised and surrounded, and the gallant young commander, the queen's dear friend, the idol of the army, fell while rallying his men. Louise, who had hurriedly joined the king from Weimar, could hardly be persuaded to leave him. But on the evening of October 13th, he confided to her a cavalry escort, promising speedy tidings of the coming battle. As she threaded the lonely passes of the Harz Mountains, she heard the distant cannonading, and a broken sentence now and again fell from her lips. "We know that all things work together for good." Late in the misty October twilight, she drove into Brunswick. At Brandenburg, a courier brought the news her trembling heart awaited. All was lost. 20,000 Prussians lay on the fields of Auerstadt and Jena, and the French were already in Weimar. The king was alive, but 2 horses had been killed under him. Grief-stricken, travel-worn as she was, Louise must not halt. Before she reached Berlin, her children had been sent to Schwedt-on-Oder. She followed thither, almost terrifying them by her changed, despairing looks. As soon as she could check her weeping, she told her boys all she knew about Prince Louis's death. Do not grieve for him. Be ready for Prussia's sake to meet death as he met it. And then, in burning, never-forgotten words, she bade them one day free their country and break the power of France. There seemed only a choice between utter destruction and utter submission, And yet, when Napoleon demanded the cessation of almost the whole kingdom, Friedrich Wilhelm and his wife agreed that only determined resistance can save us. She was slowly rallying at Königsberg from a fever caught in the crowded city when the cry was raised of the coming French. Propped by pillows, swathed in shawls, she drove through blinding sleet to Memel, the one fortress still left to the king. At her first halting place, the wind whistled through a broken window, and the melting snow dripped from the roof onto her bed. Her companions trembled for her, but she, calm and trustful, hailed as a good omen the sunshine which welcomed them within the walls of Memel. A week later, Bennigsen and his Russians, who had been wading knee-deep through Polish forests and fording swollen streams, always with 90,000 Frenchmen in hot pursuit, turned to bay amid the frozen lakes and drifted snows of Eylau. Next day, those snows for miles around were red with blood. It was hard to tell with whom the costly victory lay, but Napoleon dispatched Bertrand to the Russian outpost to propose an armistice, and Bennigsen sent him on to Memel, reminding the Prussian king that it could not be their interest to grant what it was Napoleon's interest to ask. The terms were, indeed, far easier than those offered after June, but Friedrich Wilhelm, true to the ally who had held the field almost single-handed through that terrible winter, would make no separate agreement, nor did Louise receive more favorably a message to herself, conveying Napoleon's wish to pay his court to her in her own capital. Though the piercing Baltic winds tried her strength greatly, she employed herself whenever able in reading and visiting the overfull hospitals. To a dear friend she said, "I can never be perfectly miserable while faith in God is open to me. Only by patient perseverance," so she wrote to her father, "can we succeed. Sooner or later, I know, we shall do so." It was not to be yet. On June 14, 1807, Napoleon annihilated the Russians at Friedland, and 4 days later Danzig fell. Her tone grew sadder. "We are not yet bereft of peace. My great sorrow is being unable to hope." As the Tsar could resist no longer, and Napoleon desired peace, they met at Tilsit, and there, on a covered raft, moored midway in the Niemen, arranged the outlines of a treaty. The next day, Friedrich Wilhelm, yielding to stern necessity, accepted terms, to the last degree hard and overwhelming. The Tsar, believing that Louise might move even Napoleon to clemency, her husband begged her to join him at Tilsit. On reading this summons, she burst into tears, declaring this the hardest task ever given to her to do. "With my broken wing, how can I succeed?" she pathetically asked. Napoleon paid his respects soon after her arrival, and they met at the stairhead. Louise, for Prussia's sake, forced herself to utter courteous regrets that he should have to mount so steep a staircase. He answered blandly that no difficulties were feared when striving for a reward beyond. Then, touching her gauze robe, asked, "Is it crape?" "Shall we speak of such trifles at such a time?" was her only reply. He was silent, then demanded, "How could you make war on me?" She told him that they had overrated their strength, and relying on the great Friedrich's fame, you deceived yourselves. Louise's clear eyes met his steadily. "Sire, resting on the great Friedrich's fame, we might naturally deceive ourselves, if indeed we wholly did so." Then she told him that she had come to entreat him to be generous to Prussia. He answered respectfully, but made no promise. Again, with exceeding earnestness, she implored at least for Magdeburg. Just then Friedrich Wilhelm entered. and Napoleon abruptly took leave. "Sire," said Talleyrand warningly to him when they were alone, "shall posterity say that you threw away your great conquest for the sake of a lovely woman?" Louise, meanwhile, dwelt again and again on Napoleon's words. "You ask a great deal, but I will think about it." Yet her heart was heavy, and when arrayed for the evening banquet, in the splendid attire so long unworn, she likened herself sadly to the old German victims decked for sacrifice. Napoleon said of her afterward, "I knew I should see a beautiful and dignified queen. I found the most interesting woman and admirable queen I had ever known." The Treaty of Tilsit restored to Friedrich Wilhelm a fragment of his kingdom, but even this was to be held by the French till after the payment of a huge indemnity. Napoleon's threat that he would make the Prussian nobles beg their bread had hardly been a vain one, for the unhappy Prussians had to feed, lodge, and clothe every French soldier quartered in their land. Dark as was the outlook, Louise was upheld by the loving pride in her husband. After Eylau he might have deserted a faithful ally. This he would not do. I believe his conduct will yet bring good fortune to Prussia. To help forward that good fortune, they sold most of the crown lands and the queen's jewels, and had the gold plate melted down. Amid their heavy anxieties and pains, they were not wholly unhappy, these two who loved each other so entirely. "My Louise," the king said to her one day, "you have grown yet dearer to me in this time of trouble, for I more fully know the treasure I possess." She too could write of him, "The king is kinder to me than ever, a great joy and reward after a union of 14 years." Still those about her told of sleepless nights when prayer was her only relief. Her eyes had lost their brightness, her cheeks were pale, her step languid. By the Christmas of 1808, the last French soldier had quitted Prussian soil, but it was not deemed safe for the royal family to return at once to Berlin, and they spent the summer at Hufen, near Königsberg. Parents and children were constantly together, and the mother taught herself to believe that the sharp trials of those years would tell for good on her boys and girls. If they had been reared in luxury and prosperity, they might think that it must always be. It was not till the end of 1809 that the exiles turned their faces homeward. They traveled slowly, for the queen was still feeble. Everywhere a glad welcome greeted them, and on December 23rd, the day which 16 years before she had entered the capital a girl bride, Louise drove through its familiar streets in a carriage presented to her by the rejoicing citizens. Her father was waiting at the palace gate. He helped her to alight and led her in. 3 years had gone by since she last crossed the threshold of her home, and what years they had been! Nor was the return all joy, for she knew and dreaded the changes she would find there. Napoleon and his generals had not departed empty-handed. They had stripped the rooms of paintings and statues, of manuscripts and antiquities. As the doors closed, a great shout arose from the vast crowd before the palace. Presently she appeared in the balcony, and all saw the traces of long anguish in the lovely face, now bright with grateful smiles. After a solemn service in the Dom, the king and queen drove through the illuminated city to the opera house. The queen sat beside her husband, so wrote Fouque afterward, and as she talked she often raised her eyes to him with a very touching expression. "Our beloved queen has thanked us with tears. Bonaparte has dimmed those heavenly eyes, and we must do all we can to make them sparkle again." The bare walls, the empty cabinets of the palace, accorded with the most ascetic habits now maintained there. Self-denial was made easy by one belief, that Prussia would arise from her great suffering stronger than before. The king and queen were not left to work alone toward that high end. Able generals replaced those who, through treachery or faint-heartedness, had surrendered the fortresses. Stein, now chief minister, curtailed the rights of the nobles and gave the serfs an interest in guarding the soil they tilled, while Scharnhorst, by an ingenious evasion of Napoleon's edict limiting the Prussian army, contrived to have 200,000 men rapidly drilled and trained. The universities founded at Berlin and Breslau became the headquarters of the secret societies for the deliverance of the fatherland. Princes and professors, merchants ruined by the Berlin decrees, and peasants ground down by the French exactions, joined the Jugendbund and implicitly obeyed the orders of its unseen heads. Through town and country spread that vast brotherhood, fired by the songs of Tieck and Arnhem to live or die for Prussia. And Louise watched thankfully the dawning promise of better days, though alas, we may die before they come. Perhaps that sad presentiment haunted her husband too. If she jested with her children, he would say wistfully, "The Queen is quite herself today. What a blessing it would be if her mind recovers its joyful tone." That spring, Louise was attacked by spasms of the heart. They did not last long, and when the court moved to Potsdam, she seemed to regain strength, and showed much interest in discussing with Bishop Eilert how best to train her boys so that they might serve their country. Though very weak, she accompanied her family to Hohengeritz, the king perforce returning to Berlin. The loving eyes that watched her saw signs of amendment, but early on Monday, July 16th, the spasms recurred. For hours, no remedies availed. She could only gasp for air, air, and when the sharp pain had passed, lay exhausted, now murmuring a few words of some hymn, learnt as a child, faintly thanking God for each solace sent her, or entreating her grandmother to rest. No complaint passed her lips. She was only very, very weary. They told her that couriers had been dispatched for the king, and she asked anxiously, "Will he soon come?" Before dawn he came, bringing the 2 elder boys. For those who tried to cheer him, he had only one mournful reply: "If she were not mine, she might recover." A gleam of joy lighted her pale face when he came to her bedside, but perceiving his emotion, she asked, "Am I then so very ill?" Unable to reply, he hurriedly left the room, and she said to those standing by, "His embrace was so wild, so fervent, that it seemed as though he would take leave of me. Tell him not to do that, or I shall die at once." He returned, bringing in the children. "My Fritz, my Wilhelm." She had only time for one long gaze, and then the agonizing pain came again. One of the doctors tried to raise her, but she sank back. "Only death can help me." And as all watched in breathless silence, she leaned her head against the shoulder of a faithful attendant, murmured, "Lord Jesus, shorten it," and with one deep-drawn breath, passed away. End of section 9.